All right, I'm happy to introduce our next speaker, a longtime friend, colleague, and a really good source of scientific information in Florida for a very long period of time, Karl Havens, Executive Director of Florida's Sea Grant Program. He's also a professor in fisheries and aquatic sciences. He holds a PhD in biology from West Virginia University and has been on the faculty of University of Pennsylvania, Kent State University, and he was chief environmental scientist for 12 years at the South Florida Water Management District. Karl examines how natural and anthropogenic stressors affect lake ecosystems with a focus on the structure and function of their food webs. And recently he's been working on climate variation and how that affects lakes, in particular cyanobacterial harmful algal blooms. And he also actively disseminates information to lay audiences, particularly work related to algal blooms. He's been around for a while. He has 25 years of experience working with Lake Okeechobee. He was a member of the SERP restudy team, and most importantly now for us, he's a member of the Committee on Independent Scientific Review of Everglades Restoration Progress of the National Academy of Sciences. Karl's produced over 150 papers in his areas of expertise, several book chapters, and a number of books. We're really happy to have Karl here. Help me welcome him to GEER.
So thanks, Nick, for inviting me and the organizing committee. I appreciate it. And just a little context. We live in a beautiful state. 200 million people come here a year. There's 20 million of us that live here. And a lot of folks that live here are here for the clean waters, the beautiful beaches, the wetland habitats that we have around the state. People fish and they swim and they water ski and recreate. And yet we're in a state where the landscape is saturated with nutrients. In living here and developing the land, we've fertilized our lawns, we've put in septic systems, we have a large agricultural enterprise that has used fertilizers on the land. We have waste products from our homes, some of it's been spread on the landscape. And the juxtaposition of those two things is not a good situation. And we're seeing the effects of it very dramatically in recent years with these huge blooms of microcystis that have been happening in Lake Okeechobee and also in the estuaries. So I'm going to talk about what's been happening recently, and then I'm going to talk about what might happen in the future as climate change influences conditions in Florida. What I'm talking about today is happening across the United States, and it's happening globally. It's not just Florida. So these large microcystis blooms that I'll be talking about, we're seeing them in India and China and Africa, South America, across the US. And so it's a phenomenon that we're trying to understand why it's becoming more prevalent. And it's problematic because they're toxic and they're harmful to the environment, to the economy, and to the ecosystems that they occur in. So let me just, I'm going to just do a little primer on harmful algal blooms for people who aren't in this area of expertise. I want to talk about what happened last year, or people that don't remember, and we probably all do, but I'm going to quickly go through that. I want to speculate on what precipitated the outcome, the outbreak of the blooms, and then I want to talk about what's changed in the last 25 years, because what we're seeing right now is not what we saw when I came to Florida 27 years ago. I want to talk about nitrogen and phosphorus, because we always talk about phosphorus, but we don't talk much about nitrogen. And we, my colleagues and I, think nitrogen is very important with the issues we're seeing now. How could climate change affect the future in regard to harmful algal blooms if we don't do something pretty darn soon to control nutrient inputs? And then what are the impacts and what are the solutions? So harmful algae blooms. So interesting, they're beautiful. I mean, if you look at a satellite image of a microcystis bloom, I mean, look how cool that looks. Oh, it's like three-dimensional, sticking out at you. It's fluorescent green. It's a really cool thing, And if you are a lab person like myself or Barry Rosen, and we look under microscopes, look how pretty they are under the microscope. I mean, they're wonderful, right? Really cool. And in fact, I made a photograph of an algae bloom in a lake in Gainesville, and that's pretty cool too. It looks like glaciers or something cutting through a mountainous region. It's really neat. But if you live on the water in Stewart, and that's where this picture was taken in 2016 in front of some people's condo, it's not such a good thing. You get this nasty, smelly, toxic stuff. in the basin where you have your boats and where you go out, and it's further out into the estuary where you recreate, and it's a big concern. And so these blooms, I looked at the environmental effects a number of years ago in a project that we did with the EPA, where we brought a bunch of people together and we looked at human health effects, environmental effects, economic effects, and so forth. There's a lot of ways that harmful algal blooms can affect the ecology of an ecosystem, ranging from changing the amount of oxygen in the water, to changing the pH, to producing toxins that can affect zooplankton and fish and other organisms. And there are effects both when the blooms are alive and growing, and then when they die. Because when these blooms collapse, if it happens very rapidly, the decomposition can remove a tremendous amount of oxygen from the water, and you can get fish kills. And when the blooms collapse, a lot of times there's toxins inside of the cells that are released into the water, and the toxin levels can shoot up and become much higher. We didn't, in this particular paper that I wrote, consider economic and human health effects, but those are really on the forefront right now, and I know people that live along the coast are constantly wondering, what's going to happen to me and my children and my family with this stuff in the water? Are we going to get liver cancer? Are we going to get Alzheimer's? What about respiratory irritation, skin irritation? It isn't as well understood what the human health effects are of blue-green algae blooms compared to red tides, which have primarily a respiratory effect. It's an area that still needs considerable research. Economic effects. What happens if you have a home on the waterfront and you're wanting to sell it, and people come to look at it, and the water's got this green, stinky, slimy stuff? And I care about those people, but I think about, what about the people that don't have any resilience, that make minimum wage, don't have any money in the bank, and they get laid off for the summer because their fishing tackle shop closes, or the motel they work at as a maid closes? They have no resilience at all. What happens to that part of the population? So this is a big deal in Florida and in other areas that are impacted by these things. And this is just a picture that I should have had up when I was talking about that. But we know that red tide can be aerosolized, and the toxins from cyanobacteria seem to also be able to do that too. So let me just quick overview. So cyanobacteria, they're called blue-green algae. They're not really algae. They're a kind of bacteria that have pigments in them, so they look like algae. Fresh water, we know they're fueled by excess inputs of nutrients into systems. There are some lakes in Florida that have naturally high nutrients. Lake Okeechobee is not one of those. It has high nutrients from human causes. They produce neurotoxins. Fish kills can be linked with oxygen depletion, and they're stimulated by nutrient inputs. And there's some pictures of some of the species that commonly occur. So that's Lake Okeechobee back in the 1990s, in the early 90s, and there's a boat going there, and that's a bloom of Anabina. And it's a species that used to form blooms most of the time in Lake Okeechobee, and it's interesting because it's able to get nitrogen that diffuses into the water from the atmosphere. So we call it a nitrogen fixer. I'm not going to talk very much about red tide because the causes of red tide are really not well understood. We know that it's a natural phenomenon, that they occur offshore. They've been documented back into the 1800s and maybe earlier. Sometimes currents carry them to shore, and we get problems along our beaches with respiratory things and fish kills. But we don't really know whether or not we don't know the extent to which they're stimulated by natural upwelling versus nutrients that are coming off the landscape. So I'm going to talk about blue-green algae, where we have a better understanding of the cause. This is an algae. It's not a bacteria. It's a dinoflagellate, and these are marine. And the main thing that they do, if you've been to the beach when there's a red tide, is they produce a toxin that gets aerosolized with salt grains into the air, and when you breathe them in, you cough. And we canceled our summer vacation last year because of red tide, so that wasn't good. And the economic effects are interesting because you think about that. I live in Florida, and I canceled my vacation last year because there was a red tide in Sarasota, and we've been going there for 15 years. And we'll go back this summer, because I figured there's not going to be a red tide this summer. We'll be cool. But what if it came from Japan or India or Germany or something like that, and you got there and you went on the beach and you started coughing and stuff, right? What would you do? You could go back home and you're going to tell all your friends, our vacation got ruined, don't go to Florida, they have this nasty stuff in the water. And so economic effects can last for a number of years. So summer 2018, we had this massive bloom in Lake Okeechobee. It started mostly in the southwestern corner. Eventually the winds and currents carried it and covered the entire lake. It was microcystis when it started. It went away for a while. It resumed back again, and it was that Anabina species that can fix nitrogen. The first bloom probably ran out of nitrogen, and then a nitrogen fixer came in, and then microcystis came back. And so we had a lake-wide bloom. And this has happened in 2016, and it happened in 2010 and 2005. And I used to tell people, in the middle of this lake, you don't get large algal blooms because the water's too turbid and there's not enough light. But that's not true anymore, so I can't tell my old story, because now we have blooms that cover the entire surface of this huge lake. So it's very much like the western basin of Lake Erie, and we've been working with scientists from Ohio State because they've been studying those blooms, and those are also microcystis blooms. And then last year, we had a red tide in the Gulf of Mexico. Both of these sets of imagery are done in cooperation with our colleagues in the National Ocean Service. And we've been doing work with them where they've been taking satellite imagery and with some ground truthing, putting it into terms of intensity of different kinds of blooms. And with the red tide, we're getting to a place where we're able to actually come up with real-time estimates of what respiratory distress might be in particular areas based on the satellite imagery. That's probably this year, and next will be something that will be really valuable. So what are the contributing factors? To get an algae bloom, you have to have certain things. You need to have, in the lake or the estuary, high levels of nutrients. And the primary ones are nitrogen and phosphorus. And you need to have the species that can form the blooms. And in this case, I have a little microscope photo of microcystis, and that was the main species that formed the bloom that we saw last year. And then once those things are in the system, it's literally favorable weather conditions. You get into the summer and the water heats up and you get long days with a lot of sunlight and relatively calm conditions, and then the blooms come. And so, I mean, if we have a lot of rain that washes nutrients off the landscape, we have enough nutrients in many of our waters that the weather is controlling the formation of the blooms. Not a good thing. Okay, so I want to talk about the setup conditions last year. And so we heard about Hurricane Irma in the last talk. So we had this very intense hurricane, ran almost up the spine of the peninsula of Florida. And it's a little bit hard to see in this map, but this is a map of rainfall intensity. And some of the areas north of Lake Okeechobee, east, and especially west, got a tremendous amount of rain, 10, 15 inches of rain during the day and a half that storm was going through. Well, so what? Well, the landscape north of Lake Okeechobee is a modified landscape. It's not all natural land. It's a variety of different kind of land uses ranging from urban to citrus, beef cattle, dairy. There's residential areas. There's a variety of places in that landscape that have nutrients that are in the soil, in wetlands, on site, nitrogen and phosphorus. And when you get a heavy rain event, there's a flushing of that material out of the watershed. And it's not just contemporary nutrient sources, it's also nutrients from past activities where someone has been polluting the environment and they really cleaned up their act, but the stuff that they were releasing before is still there. It's just downstream a little bit, just waiting to be carried into the lake. And it might take decades for it to all get washed out. And this is just, I'd pull up some data from Lake Okeechobee, and the Hurricane Irma happened where that blue triangle is. And so I wanted to see, like, what was going on with dissolved nitrogen and phosphorus measured by the Water Management District after the hurricane. And the levels are high, and we've looked at other hurricanes, and this always happens. Lake Okeechobee has a lot of available phosphorus in it almost all of the time from mixing from the sediments. Nitrogen probably is coming in from the watershed. It does not include dissolved organic nitrogen, and dissolved organic nitrogen is probably a bigger culprit in stimulating microcystis blooms, but I think it gives a kind of a proxy of nitrogen coming in that stimulated the bloom that we saw last year, and then we ended up with this. Okay, so the coastal connection. This is an interesting thing. Last year, there was a bloom in Lake Okeechobee, and there was a bloom in the St. Lucie estuary, and there was a bloom in the Caloosahatchee estuary. And in all three cases, it was microcystis. In the estuaries, there was a mixture with some other species of algae. And so one of the things that was evident is that when the bloom happened in Lake Okeechobee, the water was high in the lake. The Corps of Engineers was releasing water to the estuaries. And it was very evident that microcystis was flowing down the canals into the estuary. And some of the blooms that we saw, and especially in the St. Lucie estuary, in the main stem where the water was flowing through quickly, it was just algae being transported down along from the lake. And that's not to say that microcystis blooms can't form in backwaters and areas of the St. Lucie estuary, because that watershed has nutrient pollution problems too. But we think that to some extent, Lake Okeechobee was seeding the bloom, at least in the St. Lucie estuary, if not also the Caloosahatchee. I'm just showing on here that there was a big red tide last year. We don't know that that big red tide was related to the nutrient discharges that were happening. A paper just came out last week, in fact, from a researcher at the University of South Florida that showed that last year was a very extreme upwelling event that hadn't been seen in a century, and that may have stimulated that big bloom. It was a big year for Saharan dust, and I won't get into the details of how that's related, but it is related to indirectly providing nitrogen to the red tide algae from another species of algae. But it could be, and if you read that paper by Bob Weisberg, you'll notice he says in there that, and nutrients coming off of the landscape could stimulate these blooms, and it's kind of a natural thing. But once those red tides get going and they kill fish and the fish release nutrients, there's a lot of feedback things that happen to keep those blooms going. So I'm not going to talk that much about red tides. I don't study red tides also. It's just a picture of water flowing under the turnpike going towards the St. Lucie estuary last year, and there's some microcystis flowing along on the surface of the water. And as I said before, it isn't just the northern watershed up north of Lake Okeechobee that has nutrient sources. This is land use in the watershed of the St. Lucie estuary, and it is very heavily developed into agriculture, urban, and residential land uses. And there are many sources of nutrients there, whether they be septic tanks, whether they be lawn fertilizers, or agricultural nutrient runoff. And we don't have a good understanding of the relative contribution of those different sources, and it's a real big need to figure that out, because you can't solve a problem unless you know where it's coming from. And the same thing on the Caloosahatchee side, a large amount of development in the landscape, heavily agricultural in this case, but then when you get down near Fort Myers, urban and residential, more nutrient sources. So all of these places have the potential, with heavy rains, to have a flush of nutrients that are just perfect for growing harmful algal blooms. Now, what has changed? We've been asking this question. There's a group of us. Hans Perl from University of North Carolina and I have been working together with some colleagues from around the world, because we've been seeing these big microcystis blooms popping up in a variety of large lakes. And what we've identified is that it's probably phosphorus-saturated lakes that are being stimulated by inputs of mainly dissolved organic nitrogen after rain events that are stimulating these blooms. But we don't completely know. I do know that in Lake Okeechobee, the problem used to be Anabaena blooms. And Anabaena, as I said, it's an alga that can get nitrogen from the atmosphere that diffuses into the water. And now when we have blooms, they're almost always microcystis. And microcystis can't do that. It has to have nitrogen that comes in from outside of the system and is in the water already. And so something has changed in the nitrogen dynamics in the watershed, and we're not sure, but the kind of blooms that are dominating seem to have changed. And this seems to be, again, a globally evident phenomenon. And just some pictures of some lakes from around the world, India, China, Florida, and South America, with intense blooms of microcystis, all taken in 2016, and then we saw the same thing last year. So we did a funny thing. We're writing a paper right now to try to document that these microcystis blooms are increasing. And this is a little bit silly, but we were just playing around and we looked at the literature to see what percentage of the papers published in the literature since 1990 that have the words algae bloom also have microcystis in their title. And it's been going up. Anabina has been saying flat, or Anabina, or the new name of that species that I can't pronounce. And but we have other lines of evidence too, but this is kind of a funny thing that we did that I thought I could just show that it goes along with other evidence that we have. So, and I was mentioning nitrogen. So nitrogen is interesting. So phosphorus in lakes, I was saying those lakes that are saturated with phosphorus. Once phosphorus gets into some of these lakes, especially shallow lakes where the wind can mix sediments into the water column, phosphorus can hang around for a long time, until it's buried. Nitrogen doesn't do that in lakes. The nitrogen cycle is complex and has a lot of microbial components, and nitrogen tends to be gassed off into the atmosphere in a year or two or three. And so the nitrogen needs to come into the lake from an outside source to stimulate these blooms. And so I want to talk about nitrogen and phosphorus. There's been a dogma, I call it, in limnology since the 1970s, that if you control phosphorus, you can control algae blooms. And it's based on work done in Canada, in the experimental lakes area, on a particular kind of lakes where maybe this is true, but I'll tell you in a minute that I don't think that's right either. What do we know now? We know now that a lot of lakes, you need to control phosphorus and nitrogen. And we don't think they were right back in the 1970s, because we've gone back and I'm not going to mention names of researchers in Canada, and we've gone back and we've analyzed all of the data from whole lake nutrient addition experiments. And we found that nitrogen additions are more likely to stimulate increased toxic algal blooms than phosphorus additions. And we made this kind of a funny graph because the authors of a paper that were rebutting an earlier paper of ours put a stupid-looking cartoon that was a house of cards that was going to fall that said N and P on it. And so we made this for our paper that we published in Environmental Science and Technology. But right, so there's been 9 lakes that have been experimentally treated with phosphorus, and they've on average had an increase in chlorophyll, which is a measure of algae, of about 30%. And there's 4 lakes that have been treated only with nitrogen experimentally, including some in Canada, and they've had an increase in chlorophyll of over 120%. And then if you add the two together, you get a tremendous increase in the amount of algae that's in the water. So what do we know for certain? A lot of lakes are saturated with phosphorus today. Inputs of nitrogen can stimulate microcystis blooms and other kinds of toxic cyanobacteria, and Lake Okeechobee is one of those lakes. Climate change, we need to think about the future. This graph on the side, if you can see it, shows the optimum temperature for growth of different kinds of algae, and cyanobacteria, or blue-green algae, like warm water. In fact, Hans, my colleague, has a paper in Science called Blooms Like It Hot. And cyanobacteria like warm water. And if the waters continue to warm, we expect that there'll be an increased prevalence of blooms. And this plot on the right is from a paper that we did a few years ago. And let me just explain it quickly without having to look at it and try to figure it out. If you're at a low level of nitrogen, you can increase temperature and not much bad happens. But if you're at a high level of nitrogen in a lake, as you increase temperature, the occurrence of cyanobacteria exponentially rises, and it rises in an unpredictable manner, a nonlinear manner. And what it means is that there's an urgency in controlling nutrients, because we can get to a point where with warmer water, it's going to be very challenging to control these blooms. Because at the same level of nutrients that we have now, blooms could be more intense in the future because of the warmer water. So in estuaries, we need to think about warming, and we also need to think about things like droughts. Lakes and estuaries, I think we need to also consider with climate change that there could be more things happening with climate change. There could be more intense rain events, and if there are more intense rain events that are predicted by some of the global climate change models, there could be flushes of nutrients into lakes and estuaries. And if we get droughts, there are certain systems that have an interesting response where blooms become more frequent and intense when there are droughts. Lake Apopka, which is not in this region that we're talking about here at the meeting, is one of those lakes, and I've studied Lake Apopka quite a bit. And when there are droughts, that lake loses 80% of its water. And it's all concentrated down into this nasty little pool in the middle of the lake with 1 million fish, and they get terrible blooms of algae. So that's a different kind of a situation. But droughts and intense rainfall events can play into what happens with these blooms. And so we need to be thinking about climate change and not just how things are now. Solutions. So there's not a quick fix. And no one is going to invent a chemical that we can go spread on the water and kill blue-green algae or red tides or detoxify them. We can do it in a swimming pool. I can do it with that blue stuff that I put into my pool to get stuff out of the water. And I could do it in a little blind canal where people have their boats. But we're not going to go sprinkle it on the Gulf of Mexico, and we're not going to go sprinkle it all over Lake Okeechobee or the St. Lucie or Caloosahatchee estuaries. And so that the scale that we're dealing with makes it much more difficult to deal with this problem. We've got very large ecosystems that are being affected by these blooms. This is a slide from a paper that we did a couple of years ago, and it just shows all of the different kinds of things that are traditionally used to control cyanobacteria blooms. And the ones at the top and the left and the right are the ones that make the best sense for our systems, and that is to control nutrient sources, and then to go after what we call legacy nutrients, nutrients from past sources with watershed scale projects. And those things are happening. So, I mean, there's things happening. It's not like we're not doing anything. Things are happening, but they have not been effective, clearly. We've got a landscape covered with nutrients. We've been doing things since I came to Florida and way before that, and we're still having these big blooms. So we need to figure out what's going on. Why are the things that we're doing not effectively controlling these outbreaks? Solutions in Florida, long term. Identify the sources. Is it agriculture? In some areas, is it septic tanks? In some areas, is it lawn fertilizer? Yes. Depends where you are. And so in any given area, you need to know what the main source is and then go after that source. And it's not going to be the same everywhere. It's not going to be agriculture everywhere or septic tanks everywhere. It's going to depend on the location. Make sure the best management practices that we have really are the best and that they're doing their job. And not just controlling phosphorus, but also controlling nitrogen. Now the information is emerging that's pointing a finger at nitrogen as being really important. Be able to treat the legacy nutrients, both nitrogen and phosphorus. In a shorter term, I think we, within 5 years, will have better predictive capability, so that if you ask me right now, are we going to have this happen again this year in regard to red tides or blue-green blooms, I could tell you with a pretty high certainty, yes or no. We're developing the predictive capability that I talked about of using satellite imagery to tell people next week is probably going to be a bad week to go to the beaches in Sarasota based on the trajectory of where the blooms are moving. And so that's something in the midterm. And in the short term, there is an opportunity, I think, to better characterize impacts, especially economic impacts. We can do that relatively quick. Some of the human health effects that are short term, contact dermatitis, respiratory effects of exposure to cyanobacteria, things like liver cancer and Alzheimer's and things like that, they take a longer time, of course, to really understand that. Oh, and I'm done. And so I'll leave you with my beautiful photo of a cyanobacteria bloom. Thanks.
open the floor to questions. Start over here. And please identify yourself.
Okay. Bill Lauda, Florida Atlantic University. Karl, you mentioned organic nitrogen. I'm just wondering if there could be a link with the Oklahoma City bombing. Ammonium, wait a minute, wait a minute. Ammonium nitrate was replaced with urea primarily as a fertilizer.
Yeah.
Okay, because ammonium nitrate was the oxidant used to blow up that building.
Yeah.
Okay, now I'm just wondering if there's a link of going to an organophosphate nitrogen primarily as a agricultural nitrogen source in their fertilizer. One of my PhD students is I put him on to looking at all types of nitrogen. We just started this, and urea is going to be one of the ones we're going to be looking at. I'm just wondering if that is maybe what you were getting at is as a type of organonitrogen.
Yeah, so that's a cool question that started off kind of weird, but it's a really good question because so we've done studies in Lake Okeechobee where we've labeled different forms of nitrogen with stable isotopes. So we made N15 labeled nitrate, nitrite, ammonia, and urea, and what we found was that the urea was the most rapidly cycled and used source of nutrients by the algae blooms when we were out there doing that work. And so it confirms what you're saying. I don't think we understand it well enough for me to say yes, but it fits together nicely.
Okay.
Hi, Karl. Dave Kravinoff from the U.S. Geological Survey. Great talk, and the harmful algal blooms are a phenomenon going on everywhere, as you really nicely laid out. I guess my question is has there really been, over the last 15, 20 years, a tipping point that is causing this to accelerate, or is it just awareness? And the reason I bring this up is I don't study harmful algal blooms, but I do study mercury, and I go back more than 30 years in that problem area. And when we first started looking at mercury in the mid-1980s, it was a problem that was perceived to be in northern lakes, because that's where it was discovered.
Yeah.
Well, then all of a sudden a panther dies here in Florida, and a vet ascribes mercosis, and all of a sudden, the problem's here too. 10 years after that, it's a problem that's perceived globally. The situation hadn't changed at all. It had always been there for many, many decades with a mercury problem. We just didn't know about it because people didn't look or report on it. Harmful algal blooms have gotten their big play in the press now in the last few years. So how much is just awareness and reporting driving this perception?
So thank you. That's a good question, and this is a challenge, and we don't have a great answer to that. And in part, I think you're right, and it's also related to this nitrogen and phosphorus thing that we started looking at, 10 years ago, and had just sort of been accepted for a long time until we started reanalyzing data that we were able to get from the researchers that had done those original studies. And then we published some papers, and then they published papers, and then we had a special session at ASLO arguing with each other. And so it was the thing that was there all the time, and it kind of emerged. And so trying to figure out, so those of us who study these lakes have been seeing these microcystis blooms, and so we all recognize that, wow, I've been working on this lake for 30 years or 20 years or whatever, and it didn't used to be like this, but the data sets don't exist. It's very rare to have a good data set that goes back for 30 years where you can do a systematic, worldwide, unbiased assessment of a hypothesis that microcystis has become a bigger player. There are data in some lakes, and it's biased immediately because it's the lakes that we're studying because they're polluted by human activities, and so it's a real tough one. Yeah. So I'm kind of my premise is, and Hans and I go back and forth on this because he wants to say that they're becoming more prevalent, and my thought is we don't need to do that. The issue is they're a big deal right now, and we need to do something about it. And it doesn't matter whether they're becoming more prevalent or not. Yeah.
Andy?
Dr. Havens, thanks for the presentation and being here. Andy Leshiver from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Of course, we work with water, hydrology primarily, and so you talked a lot about the nutrients, and so I'm just curious about your perspective on hydrology and lake stage and duration, whether that plays a role in harmful algal blooms.
So
And why are you
hydrology,
asking that?
hydrology is an interesting thing, and I didn't mention hydrology. So, you know, one of the things in Florida that's allowed all of us to live here is the drainage system, and it works great, right? When it rains really hard, usually our houses don't flood because the water gets carried away to the ocean very quickly by canals. Guess what? It also carries nutrients off of the landscape very quickly into our lakes and our waters. So that's an issue, you know. That's not the question you asked, but I didn't say that, so I wanted to say. Lake Okeechobee management, and I don't know, that's a complex thing, and there's not enough time to get into that, but we could talk later.
Okay. So we've got 3 more people. Let's do 3. We'll do 3 questions, quick questions and quick answers, and then we'll adjourn. I'll come back over here to.
Hi, Stephanie Johnson with the National Academies. Thanks, Carl. Terrific talk. I'm interested in the question of seeding the northern estuaries, and what does it take to seed an algal bloom in an estuary, because the new EAA reservoir was really, the momentum came from the desire to reduce algal blooms, but how much reduction of discharge is needed, how much seeding, and how much is a role of nitrogen inputs versus the algae, the bacteria themselves?
I mean, so this is a difficult one. There are nutrients in the St. Lucie estuary, or in the Caloosahatchee, and the Caloosahatchee gets big blooms sometimes when there's no lake discharges. In fact, the Corps does discharges to push the blooms out into the ocean sometimes in the dry season when that happens. The St. Lucie gets blooms of a different kind of algae sometime in the saline areas, but it gets blooms in areas that aren't affected by Lake Okeechobee discharges, microcystis blooms. And so I was mainly talking about the main stem of the estuary connected to Lake Okeechobee, that there were, a part of the microcystis that we saw last year was coming from the lake, because it was just moving down through the water, and the residence time wasn't enough for it to be developing out in that main part of the estuary. But we don't know, to what extent did the bloom in the St. Lucie estuary occur because of Lake Okeechobee discharges versus local nutrients, because there was a runoff of nutrient-rich water there too. So I mean, it was a combination. And so you don't, if you had a really rainy year in the watershed around the St. Lucie estuary and you didn't have any water coming out of Lake Okeechobee, in some areas you could have cyanobacteria blooms. But there's been a lot of years when there's been discharges from Lake Okeechobee when the lake didn't have a big bloom, and you didn't get a big bloom in the St. Lucie estuary. Circumstantial evidence, but it's a little bit of a tricky one.
All right, great, thank you. Now, we still got Dave, and I see one more person, Jennifer. Yep, I'll let all 3 of you go if quick questions and quick answers. People are waiting to go on their break.
Nick, why are you looking at me like
I'm in trouble already. Go ahead.
I'm Dave Rudnick with National Park Service. I actually do have 2 questions, but the first one I just mentioned the topic for future discussion, which is basically what sea level rise and saltwater intrusion does with nutrient availability. But hold on that, because the easier question, I think one that speaks, you have great expertise, is really trying to address what a citizen skeptic might ask about the efficacy of nitrogen control, given the ability of these cyanobacteria to fix nitrogen. How effective would that be, and considering the external input of inorganic versus organic nitrogen into a phosphorus saturated lake system where they're full of fixers?
Okay, well, right, so the blooms we're seeing now are microcystis. They don't fix nitrogen. Okay, so they have to have nitrogen coming into the system from somewhere outside. In Europe, there's been a number of examples of reducing nitrogen inputs and getting a pretty quick recovery in lakes compared to the kind of recovery you see by reducing phosphorus. And if you reduce nitrogen and I know what you're thinking about. Oh, then anabina will come in and you'll have nitrogen fixtures. It takes a lot of energy to do nitrogen fixation, and it's really clear from the literature that it can't. It can't sustain a massive bloom. Even if you look at some of the studies in the ELA, you realize that nitrogen fixation is not able to sustain a massive bloom for a long time. So we don't think that would happen.
Okay, Jen's next. You were waiting. Then we'll do one more, and then.
Hi, Carl. Jen Rehage, FIU.
Yeah.
My question was about this, the wicked problem and the long-term solutions. And
Right.
what's your take on opportunities or inflection points where we can tackle sort of the larger loading question?
So where should we start first? Or
what do you see opportunities, right, to get at the problem of the loading of either the nitrogen or the phosphorus side? Like, do you see any opportunities at a watershed scale?
From my perspective, knowing it's kind of there isn't a really fast thing if you're thinking about a year or 5 years, but getting a better handle on where are the nutrients coming from right now in the landscape, and in particular areas, what's the major source? So you might be able to clean up a particular reach of an estuary by dealing with septic tanks, if that's the major source. But you have to know that first. So that has to be quantified. North of Lake Okeechobee, what's the major source? Is it agriculture? Or is it also now a lot of nutrients coming down from the northern part of the Kissimmee River, where Orlando's grown into a huge sprawl? And we've got lawn fertilizer maybe coming into the system. So I don't know, a solution is going to be challenging without a good inventory of that. And we have good data, but it's kind of old. And the landscape has changed, and people have moved around, and there's been climate variability, and we've had hurricanes and things, and so we don't have good current data on sources. I think that's the place to start.
Okay, last question.
Yes, thank you. David Seeley, I'm an aquatic ecologist. I was a graduate at the Center for Aquatic Plants in Gainesville back in the 80s, but 30 years in Florida. One of the things that 3 projects I'm working on: Kings Bay, Crystal River area, we're doing restoration up there, and one of the key components is restoration of the submerged aquatic vegetation community.
Yep.
Lake Trafford, $21.35 million was spent demucking the lake. $25,000 was put into submerged aquatic vegetation restoration. Then that system was wiped out in the battle to control hydrilla. They used aquathol K and killed everything.
Yep.
So 9 years later, we still have an algae-dominated system. The Caloosahatchee River, we've lost thousands and thousands of acres. Virtually, Vallisneria americana has been wiped out of the system. All 3 of these systems have lost submerged aquatic vegetation for one reason or another. And I'm wondering if you could, as a main competitor for nutrient uptake, what your thoughts are on things that we can do now. Like, we're doing restoration of submerged vegetation in the Caloosahatchee as one little thing we can do positive to help.
Yeah. Right, so so submerged vegetation is really important, and the main thing that's competing for nutrients with the phytoplankton is the periphyton that's growing on the submerged vegetation, because they're both taking nutrients out of the water. And we've done radio tracer studies with phosphorus uptake in mesocosms, and we've seen that really strong competition. And if you have a big bed of SAV, that periphyton can take all of the phosphorus out of the water, and you have clear water. And we've seen it in Okeechobee. Now, some of these lakes that you mentioned, and Lake Apopka is like the worst case, it's going to be really hard to restore SAV because the sediments aren't amenable to it because they're soft, and a little bit of wind is going to uproot plants. Okeechobee is a really cool system because you've got a shoal area of about 50,000 acres that can get completely covered with submerged vegetation, whether it's vascular plants or Chara, but with periphyton on it. If the lake is low, last year the lake was high. There was no SAV over that 50,000 acres where I showed you that the bloom started. And I mean, we've shown definitively that when there is dense SAV in that area, you don't have a lot of algae in the water. The water's clear. And so it was just like another one of these things, where it's just like,